chapter 5, we will discuss about anxiety-related disorders, trauma and stress-related disorders, and obsessive-compulsive disorders. Now, when we say anxiety, this chapter in general will highlight a few terms that is very important to understand. Number 1, anxiety. Number 2, fear. Number 3, panic. And anxiety is a future-oriented state that has this characteristic of negative affect, in which normally people focus on the possibility of uncontrollable danger or misfortune. But fear is somewhat different. It is more present-oriented mood state characterized by strong urge to escape and a surge of sympathetic branch of autonomic nervous system, which means you have to do something right away. And in addition to that, we have another term called panic attacks, and we will see how panic attack is somewhat more intensive than fear and anxiety. One common theme that you will notice in this chapter is that people have concerns about their future. And in PTSD, of course, there is trauma related, but in general, if you look at this category, anxiety and stress related disorders, including obsessive compulsive disorder, people act upon certain cues and sometimes uncued fear that could happen, worries that could happen in the future. And we try to, again, I don't plan to talk about each and every symptom in these disorders. My concern would be, how do we distinguish generalized anxiety disorder from panic attack and agoraphobia? How do we differentiate that from specific phobia and that from social anxiety and so on? So my goal for you, even when you read the chapter or if you already read, when you review your notes, I want you to tell the difference, how generalized anxiety is unique by the prototypical symptoms when you compare to any other disorder in the same category. So it's a large group of disorder that has the shared common elements, and that common element is of course anxiety and fear. And there are these are one of the most common mental disorders that you see in our population. In the past, all these disorders in these chapters are called anxiety disorders. Now we have divided them into few categories, and one of them is anxiety related disorder, and the other one is trauma related disorder, and the other one is obsessive compulsive related disorder. So you do see that, as DSM-4 was informed by new research, they identified some prototypical symptoms that goes under anxiety, which is future oriented state, and some of them has to do with trauma and mainly post-traumatic stress disorder, and that will be the focus for our discussion. And the other category is obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, if you one challenge I would give you in questions and play positive questions or an exam is, I'll give you a brief statement. Can you tell which one fits best with that description? For instance, somebody who worries about almost everything, so that should indicate generalized anxiety. Somebody who fears about heart attack and dying because he or she experiences physiological symptoms and try to avoid those situations, again, that is panic attack disorder. In agoraphobia, somebody again has similar characteristic like panic attack, but the person fears about escaping from the situation and not being able to receive help. That would be agoraphobia. And disproportionate fear toward a particular object. It could be snake, spider, height, water, crowd, many things. So that is phobias. And people who worry about potential humiliation and people laughing at the person in a social gathering, that is social anxiety disorder. And some past traumatic man-caused trauma or natural disaster leading to negative affect, most of the time nightmares, difficulty sleeping, and suffering from the flashback of those memories, that is PTSD. Somebody who suffers from very strong intrusive thoughts, when I say intrusive, that's like almost out of your control. The thought comes to your mind, and to manage those intrusive thoughts, engage in stereotypical behavior, counting, cleaning, praying, and so on. So that is obsessive compulsive disorder. So in that few very brief note, what I was highlighting there is the unique features in these given different psychological disorders, and we'll see a little more detail. And I'm hoping by the end of this lecture series you can at least distinguish one anxiety disorder from the other, and also tell what makes a specific what are those prototypical symptoms. Again, that has to do with how most expert agrees that a given person has GAD, generalized anxiety, but not social anxiety disorder. So we should be able to tell the distinction between their symptom criteria when you read the case. Okay, moving on. Now, just to take a pause and look at some definitions. It's important that we distinguish these terms. Again, fear, it's an immediate, present-oriented mood state, right? We have that because we're human beings, we are living beings. And anytime you are experiencing fear, you know what happens. If you remember some biological underlying ideas we discussed, there is a surge of energy in autonomic nervous system, so we can fight, flight, or freeze. So that's where this fear reaction is activated. There is an autonomic nervous system, and specifically we know this will activate our sympathetic nervous system. So it sends a signals there, and of course as it receives the signal, there is a chain, right? There is a signal coming from brainstem. Brainstem, that's the involuntary body mechanism. That's what controls our heartbeat, body temperature, digestion process. We don't control consciously. So brainstem sends a signal to our other part of the brain, especially limbic system. Limbic system receives this message, and there is a tiny part of the brain structure called amygdala. You might have heard this quite a bit. Amygdala sends a message to our brain that there is some imminent threat coming. And as soon as you receive a signal from signal in amygdala, it tells the brain, okay, it sends a message to hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. That's the cortex, that's a higher thinking order, telling us we need to do something about it. So as soon as you receive that message from brainstem, limbic system, amygdala to prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, that is where you have this emotional responses regulated, you immediately act upon it. And you know from the biological discussion that we talked about, when you receive that message from sympathetic nervous system, our heartbeat goes up, respiration goes up, our brain receives more oxygen, your body is taking more oxygen, so it can send a lot of energy to our body parts, particularly our extremities like arms and legs. It receives more blood flow, digestion is paused, your pupil dilate, and you're getting more sunlight, more natural light to see better, and your legs are getting stronger so you can run or fight. Your muscle gets tensed, you are totally different, in a different state. So that immediate threat, that it will create a chain of response, and it's a signal that telling us something need to happen. And that could be for actual threat. Let's say you saw a tiger or a snake, You heard an earthquake, right? You heard an earthquake, so body immediately responded to that. And of course, I have to get out of here right now, or I may not make it. So this kind of fear reaction is normal when you receive actual threat. However, anxiety is slightly different. It's apprehension toward the future or future unpredictability, right? You're apprehensive. You're not sure if things go your way. So anxiety is characterized by apprehension because the future is little unpredictable. And fear, of course, is more toward immediate and present oriented, and there is a strong escapist tendency. You want to run away, right? And if you see actual snake, of course you should run away, you do something right now. But if you fear about snake that you don't see right now and you worry about that might happen to you, well, that does create somewhat similar chain reaction. You do send a signal to your sympathetic nervous system without actual danger. Now, anxiety is not a disorder or a disease by itself. Now, think of people, those who have a little anxiety. Now, imagine when you were preparing for exam. Let's say you have no anxiety at all. You're more likely to skip the lectures, skip the reading chapters, don't care much, and just do whatever is in your head. So if you look at this anxiety level and performance level, you do notice that people with little anxiety do not seem to perform well. And when people have little anxiety, very healthy amount, they tend to increase their performance. Why? They worry about what will happen in the future. What if I couldn't answer most of the question in exam? What if I don't remember some information? So I better prepare, I better read, I better take notes. So you have anxiety, you tend to do better. However, that anxiety does not continue to go up like that. That means you're more anxious, you perform more well. No, that's not the case. As your anxiety continues to spike, even you have, let's say, very anxious mind, you cannot perform super well. What happens is that level of performance goes down. So, a little anxiety is healthy because it allows people to perform well on given tasks. But when you have too much anxiety, we call severe anxiety, because that is often known as irrational. That can't help. You think too much about the future and you prepare and you constantly, preoccupied your mind with that anxiety, you are not going to do well. Your performance will go down. Why? It's irrational, because what you're preparing is perhaps unnecessary level, and it's not going to help because your brain is now too preoccupied. And keep in mind, when you think of emotions and reasoning, so right hemisphere and left hemisphere, right hemisphere is more related, that's the brain, two hemisphere of the brain. Right hemisphere is more related to emotions, and left hemisphere is more related to logic, learning, reasoning, linear thinking. So if you are learning, that means you have to use more often left hemisphere of the brain. If you're anxious, that means your right hemisphere of the brain is more activated. When your right hemisphere is too active, your reasoning does not do well. And that's why you see that in severe anxiety that lead to disorder, that lead to muscle tension, restlessness in your mind, elevated heart rate, because it does the same chain of signal. It sends a signal to autonomic nervous system, then to sympathetic nervous system, then to brainstem, limbic system, amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex. So that chain continues, and it prepare you to fight, flight, and freeze without actual threat. Imagine, that is dangerous. And I also talk about this when we talk about child abuse. If you constantly use fear-based approach when you're parenting your child, what you're doing is you are making these children hypersensitive to threat. You yell at them. You sometimes people use yelling or spanking or name calling or ridiculing. Whatever you do, what you're doing is making them apprehensive. right? Giving them anxiety. And when you have too much anxiety, imagine you have this fear reaction when you saw actual snake. If you have, again, um, anxiety that you will see a snake and you constantly prepare to run away without actual snake, what you're doing is you are taking energy from your brain and constantly looking for the sign of snake, and there is no snake. You constantly look for the sign of snake and your brain is preoccupied, and whatever happening around you, your classes, your friend talking, your family talking, they are all missed. Why? Because you're constantly scanning for the threat. That's what happened to these children too. If you constantly name, call, ridicule, and punish, those children are constantly monitoring themselves to not make any mistakes that lead to punishment. That means they're constantly worrying about their future mistakes, and they don't focus in class. They don't learn because their brain is too preoccupied avoiding mistakes and not focusing on what's happening in the present moment. So fascinating idea. And again, these two, of course, are negative affect, right? So you do see that these people cannot have positive mood state. When you are feeling physiological symptoms of anxiety, it's hard because look what happens to your body. You're tense, you're restless, your heart is very high, and you're apprehensive about the future. So there's little chance to have a positive mood state. It's constantly worrying about it, and sometime it could be inherited, right? There is a chance that it could be an inherited tendency that can make us tense and upright, and sometimes it could be learned. And we'll see a little more as we go and look at the different types of vulnerabilities. But there is another slide that I want to focus here, that is on panic attack. Now, panic attack comes so suddenly, and they typically reach a peak within 10 minutes, and they are accompanied by uncomfortable physical sensations and catastrophic thoughts. Now that is a good, clear explanation what panic attack is. Now, people may also experience limited symptom episodes, like panic attack that has only a few symptoms, like less than 4. And if you look at the symptom list in the textbook, you see most of them are like sweating or trudging or shaking or feeling of choking or chest pain or discomfort. These are typical signs when your body is overworked. And when you're exercising, if you're running a mile, these things are happening. What happened to those people who have anxiety? Well, they will misinterpret these cues as threat. So physical signs: heart palpitation, chest pain, dizziness, sweat, chill, or heat sensation. Cognitive: fear of losing control. That's a big part. Your fear of losing control is the biggest reason that makes you flee from the situation. And fear of death: they will go to doctor and check their heart, thinking that they might have an issue, might have issue in their heart, or thinking they're going crazy because it's so uncontrollable. So panic attacks are so common. Most people have at least one panic attack in their lives. People with severe anxiety may have multiple panic attacks almost every day. So when you think of panic attack, it could come with some cues and with some no cues. So unexpected attacks, when people are out of blue, they could come up when just like you're watching a TV or at your home, you're watching a game, and suddenly you felt that heart palpitation, like a severe physiological symptoms that you have trouble breathing and you cannot think anything straight. You fear that you're gonna die. Expected attacks may be cued by certain situations, like you have done something like public speaking or public presentation, or attending a big gathering, attending a meeting, being with some certain group of people, and especially in places where a person has had an attack in the past. That's more common. While driving in the location of a previous panic attack, that could be cued by the area. And being in a mall, shopping mall, because you have panic attack experience in a mall, and you're likely to experience again when you are present around those situations. So we call them cued or expected, and they're pretty closely related to phobias. It almost seems like your irrational fear toward those setting. However, panic attack is different because you do experience more than your irrational fear, but more some of those physiological symptoms. And when you're walking down the street and in a very clear day, all of a sudden, and your abrupt attack and intense fear start to come to you, and that should be considered unexpected. That's an example for unexpected. And if you are attending a baseball and remember that there was a previous experience in a panic attack experience in baseball stadium, you're more likely to experience another one that is cued or expected, right? So these two should help us to put it together, how expected and unexpected panic attack look like. Not only that, I also want you to compare the distinction between fear, anxiety, and panic attack. Let me ask you a couple of questions here. Now, if you use an integrative model of anxiety, you see that there's a possibility to have one or all of these vulnerabilities. Research suggests that we inherit a tendency to be tense, which is caused by multiple genes. And that inherited tendency can make us tense or uptight. Now, if you remember or recall diathesis stress model, there is inheritable contribution that lead to people more vulnerable to negative affect. Now, somebody inherited a father who is scared of snake or spider. The child could inherit those tendency, that vulnerable genes, and when there is appropriate stress presented, the person could develop anxiety disorder. So that's what diathesis stress model was useful for us to understand this biological vulnerability. And we'll see some other areas that is contributed from the gene. And the other vulnerability could be generalized psychological vulnerability. This is again physical sensations are potential dangers. You are anxious about health, or you constantly experience non-clinical panic attacks, and your belief, how you were taught about certain experience and your perception about future, that could lead to generalized psychological vulnerabilities. And specific generalized psychological vulnerabilities could be your tendency toward yourself. Number one could be tendency toward lack of self-confidence, and that comes from some level of parenting. When you have a super protective parenting style, constantly guiding child or giving child only safe and heavenly situations, the child may not develop self-confidence and lead to future anxiety related conditions, low self-esteem, constantly seeking approval or permission, and because the child was not explored. Not only this child, like you in general, if you have low self-esteem, that could lead to specific, we see that as a specific psychological vulnerabilities. And the other part is incapable to cope. Your physical sensations that you have, you don't know how to reduce. For instance, simply by breathing exercise or taking a deep breath, you never learned that, never used that, that could lead to developing and anxiety related problems. And you saw how your parents their attribution toward fear and future related anxiety. So learning and modeling could be one. So we do see that if a child who is afraid of animal, or let's say spider, because his father was afraid of dog, it could be specific psychological vulnerabilities, because that's what the child was modeled. And David Barlow talked about he did research that people's this vulnerability to anxiety has to do with one's sense of control over environmental events, and that lack of control over environmental events, which is also we call autonomy, that could lead to developing anxiety related disorders. Notice that the message for us to be ready to fight, flight, or freeze reaction starts from brainstem. From the brainstem, it sends a message to many parts of the brain: limbic system, amygdala, hippocampus, and all the way to our higher thinking brain we call cortex, particularly prefrontal cortex. Once you receive the message, your body reacts to that message. Now, if you go a little more detail, here we see that some specific neurotransmitters are involved in anxiety. GABA is one of them. And when you say GABA, this is most prevalent neurotransmitter that inhibits certain neural communication. So it prevents certain neurotransmitter from sending signal one to another. Now, a very fun example that I typically talk about GABA is when people, those who are on typical situation, person who is little shy, not very talking and reserved kind of a person, and when person drinks, let's say 2 to 3 bottles of beer, when you think 2 to 3 that might be a bottle, 3 bottles of beer, the person seems to be somewhat open, the person becomes little social, feel less tense, more relaxed, that seems like the same term, more relaxed, and willing to do things that typically he or she wouldn't do with that alcohol. Now, what is alcohol doing? Well, if you know the anatomy, alcohol is temporarily releasing the similar activity of GABA. That means you are experiencing an influx of GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid, which causes you to feel relaxed and calm. Now, coming back to anxiety, that also tells us when you have more activity of GABA, you feel calm and relaxed because your neural activity is more inhibited. So that also indicates that when there is low level of GABA, you're more likely to feel anxious, as if the person stopped drinking, then you feel the normal anxiety level because your neural activity is back to normal and people experience anxiety. The other neurotransmitter that is related to anxiety is noradrenaline. The term for norepinephrine, right? So when you look at this norepinephrine, or also called noradrenaline, and serotonin, these two neurotransmitter, if you see there is a deficiency in this neurotransmitter, you're more likely to experience greater anxiety. Now, the fight-flight system is partially activated by the deficiency in these two neurotransmitters, norepinephrine and serotonin. These both belong to aminobutyric family, right? Aminobutyric acid family. The other one is dopamine. Now, if you look at limbic system, behavioral inhibition system, BIS, and limbic system is most often talked when we talk about anxiety. Limbic system mediates between the brain stem, that is the lower order structure, which senses change in bodily function and communicates danger signals, to the higher order, more cognitive cortex, prefrontal cortex. So limbic system is the mediator, and there is a study that showed that when there is a deficiency or fewer norepinephrine and serotonin, you're more likely to experience higher anxiety. Another, Jeffrey Gray, a British neuropsychologist, talked about BIS, behavioral inhibition system, that is activated by danger signals arising from the brainstem or descending from the cortex, resulting in experiencing anxiety. The BIS is part of the limbic system. More specifically, it is activated by signal from the brain stem. Now, if you remember, brain stem is the part that brain is like, of course, it's closer to the spinal cord. It receives the signal from the body, right? And it takes care of almost all of the involuntary activities in our body. When the brain stem receives the signal, there is unexpected event is happening, and the signal from the cortex about perceived danger, so it's about both ways. So it receives signal from the brainstem. It also receives signal from cortex, where you just perceive something is threatening. To keep it simple, that we're trying to understand, what makes people anxious, right? So we're seeing that there is a physical sensation that we receive through our brain stem that tells our brain something is dangerous. Limbic system, of course, takes care of that communication toward, that's what mediation role is, toward the more complex thinking, that is cortex, and prepare us to respond accordingly. Now, either it is behavioral inhibition or fight flight reaction, there is something that perceived as threat, whether it is due to physiological sensation or just cognitive processing. And if you look at panic circuit, it doesn't change much. Your fight flight reaction is you perceive something is dangerous. It could be, again, you sense that your heartbeat is going up, you're breathing faster, you felt that things are going out of control. That leads to respond to think, there is the respond with apprehension, right? Respond with that something danger is imminent. Now, when you think this way, what else could affect? Well, it's not just the biological aspect. There's something that we do could also contribute to our sensitivity of brain circuits that comes from environment. For example, the great detail example in the textbook about teenage cigarette smoking. Teenagers, those who smoke, is linked to increased risk of developing anxiety and panic. And research suggests that especially generalized anxiety is 5 times more likely to develop in adults if they smoke as a teenager. And study also suggests that parents can protect their children from anxiety if they let children explore the world and deal with the unexpected. So it's very fascinating to see that children, the young folks, and also children could change to some level depending on how they were raised, what they were exposed to. So biology is, again, a single model is not always the best model to understand any of the psychological disorders. Let's take a look at comorbidities of anxiety and related disorder. Anytime you assess a person for anxiety related disorder, there is a chance that 55% of the time, that means more than half of the time, the person could also indicate another psychological disorder. And if you do assessment across the life, that means throughout the lifetime, the person is more likely to have another disorder in addition to anxiety related disorder up to 76% of the time. So that indicates comorbidity in anxiety disorder is very high. And most commonly, those who have or diagnosed with anxiety disorder, they meet also diagnosis for major depression. Now, if you remember the term comorbidity, meeting diagnostic criteria for multiple disorder at the same time. And that doesn't mean you only have some symptoms. The person shows diagnostic criteria. That means for depression, you have more than 2 major symptoms: lack of interest and lack of energy, plus at least 3 to 4 to 5 symptoms. And in other disorder, it could be similar list of symptoms. So why does this happen so often? Why people with anxiety disorders also more likely to diagnose with major depression? Well, that's where you look at commonalities. If you look at the feature of depression and anxiety, you will not be surprised. If you remember vulnerabilities, there is biological aspect, right? If you remember diathesis stress model, well, as much as you can inherit genes for anxiety, this similar feature is possible for depression. And other risk factors, family, social, psychological, learning, modeling, that could also play a role. Now, when I think of anxiety and depression, they are 2 sides of the same coin. Why this anxiety has to do with your apprehension toward the future. So your future. And depression has to do with your past, right? You are ruminating a lot, right? You ruminate about the past. You consider what happened, and when you think about the past, you blame yourself. So self-blame is there, and poor self-esteem is there. You feel like you don't have energy, you don't have knowledge or skill to take care of yourself. There is a poor energy, there's a problem with sleep. Now if you look at the diagnostic criteria, that's what you see in depression. And what do you see in anxiety? Well, you see worry. You ruminate about the past, things that didn't go well or that you couldn't control of. Worry is also something similar, but that is more future oriented. You worry about things that is not here yet. So even it is in two different timelines, the feature, the way it manifests in people is somewhat similar. So that's where they found in studies the underlying disorder has somewhat the same features. And we saw that, that in psychological vulnerabilities, we saw poor self-esteem, lack of self-confidence, poor coping skill, not having coping skill. That also relates to anxiety and depression. So even you are diagnosed with anxiety, you do have features that is similar to depression. Vulnerabilities, now besides these factors, what are some vulnerabilities? Well, the parenting style we talked about, and the modeling, the learning aspect. How were you exposed? What kind of strategy did your parents or primary caregivers used? That could be one important vulnerability factor. The other factor could be socializing. Socializing, whether you have supporting social background or lack of support. So that could be another reason that people develop anxiety disorder. And if you consider excuse me, features and vulnerabilities of anxiety, they do have shared feature with major depression. And the other interesting fact about anxiety disorder from research is that anxiety can cause or contribute to physical disorder. Now, the studies found that uniquely and significantly, anxiety has been associated with thyroid disease, respiratory disease, gastrointestinal disease, arthritis, migraine headaches, and allergic conditions. Now this is another interesting area that need more research. Whether do we know that people who have physical disorder develop anxiety disorder, or those who have anxiety disorder later develop physical disorder? Well, that's still worth looking into those conditions. It could be either way. It could be the cause, it could be the effect. And that's why we need to look beyond the basic features. Now, at least one aspect I want to mention here is that anytime you think of anxiety disorder, what you're doing is, especially fight-flight system is increasing the level of stress hormone. That increasing stress hormone in chapter 9 or 10, we will see that, how that increase in stress could damage your heart, how that could damage your internal organs, because the body is not prepared to high level of cortisol levels, right? The stress hormones, and that could damage physical well-being, and perhaps that lead to certain physical disorders. And the other worth noticing feature here is, think of somatic symptoms. Somatic symptom disorder, actually, not just somatic symptom disorder. These individuals who have somatic symptom disorder, SSD, they are very sensitive about their well-being. And when you are hypersensitive about your well-being, are you more likely to develop anxiety disorder? That's something interesting to think about, right? Individual right now, what we are dealing with in a COVID, especially during this time, people who are very sensitive about their well-being, their physical health, are they more likely to develop anxiety or panic attack disorder? Well, the evidence says yes. The number of the incidents that within last couple of years rate has gone up so high, almost threefold more than before pandemic. So people are more frequently diagnosed with anxiety and depression than number of people that they were diagnosed before pandemic. And perhaps that's why the demand for psychological health and psychological well-being is pretty high. The one important part that we cannot skip here is thinking about suicide. Now, it's in major depression, one of the major concern is, of course, suicidal ideation. Is that same in anxiety-related disorder? At least we know from studies that people with panic attack disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder are more commonly entertaining the suicidal ideation. That's a fancy way to say they think about killing themselves. That's what it means. And 20% of patients who at least once attempted committing suicide, killing themselves. I'm trying to stay away from committing. So killing themselves or attempting suicide. Even after they tried to control for, in research term they accounted for major depression, these individuals with panic attack and PTSD still made attempt for suicide. And the other interesting fact about suicide is, especially in generalized anxiety disorder and social anxiety disorder, people engage in self-injuring behaviors like self-mutilation. Why do they do that? Well, if you look at the ABC model, antecedent behavior and consequence, anytime you feel that strong anxiety because you just worry about everything in generalized anxiety and you worry about being humiliated, the behavior is to escape. Sometimes physical escape is not easy because you might be just staying by yourself and you want to escape. The thought is very strong, you feel like you might, and again the fear of future happenings is very strong, so you try to escape, and what they do is cut their wrist or injure themselves with a knife or any kind of device. What it does is temporarily take that worry or that distress due to anxiety. This stress due to anxiety is taken away. So the behavior of cutting temporarily relieve their mind or preoccupation from those thoughts for a short time. And the consequence is, temporary relief. Now, when you are temporarily relieved from that worrisome thoughts or distressing emotions, this becomes a strong maintaining conditions. That's what we call in behavioral therapy, maintaining condition. The consequence becomes maintaining condition to repeat this behavior. And coming back to suicide, those who have generalized anxiety and social anxiety disorder, they are at least once in their attempt to cut themselves or self-harming behavior, they have thought about killing themselves. So it does increase. You see that anxiety disorders do increase in people's attempt for suicide. How about when that is combined with depression? Well, you can imagine it's almost more than half of the people, if they have both anxiety and depression, more likely to attempt suicide. They try to hurt themselves, because going back here, you saw that the features, the vulnerabilities is pretty similar in anxiety and depression. And if you have both diagnoses, your chance of trying to escape from that thought, and again, very interesting idea of lack of control. You think your life is out of control. In depression, you think that what happened in the past you couldn't change or it's out of control. In anxiety, you fear that things that will happen in the future is out of control. That could be a strong motivator, and unfortunately for bad, wrong behavior, to attempt suicide or hurt themselves. And that's worth noticing in suicide part for anxiety-related disorder? Let me ask you a couple of questions. So we talked about some underlying conditions, psychological, biological, vulnerabilities, and potential causes that develop anxiety disorder. Now look at this video. It kind of captures what we've been talking so far. We talked about how individuals learn to be anxious, how biology plays a role, and if you listen to and watch this video, it puts into perspective within like a couple minutes how a person lives with anxiety and what goes through their mind. So it's a really fascinating video I want you to take a look at.
From the outside, it's easy to think that somebody's got it all figured out. Because my hair is curled and my cheeks are intentionally flushed, I must not have a care in the world. As if it were expected for my demons to be worn like a scarlet letter pinned to my chest. And they assume if you cannot see it, then it's not really there. As if pain does not exist unless you're bleeding or slung in a cast or staggering with a limp. But sometimes the most painful demons are the ones they can't even see. So we learn how to smile, how to grin and bear it, because nobody likes to talk about the tough stuff. Hell, I don't like to talk about the tough stuff. I have anxiety. It feels like every cell in my body is moving so fast that my veins are blurry. That despite the constant metronome of my heartbeat inside my ears, it's like listening to a spastic drum line. It feels like bees in my ears, like a broken white noise machine playing all of the sounds at once. And I don't even realize I'm gritting my teeth or cracking my knuckles or rubbing my forefinger against my pinky or twisting the gold band on my middle finger, holding onto myself like I'm the only lifeline bridging the gap between reality on my own 2 feet and the atomically loud abyss of noises and sounds and feelings of fleeting rushing through my veins. And I'm avoiding eye contact. Not because I'm not listening to what you're saying, because I'm listening to the sound of my own voice, hoping that through your ears you can't hear that it's 2 octaves too high and on the verge of breaking because my palms are sweating and I somehow forgot to speak with anything behind my words other than insecurity. My anxiety feels like fire. Unexplainably hot and rash and frustrating as I gnaw the inside of my cheek as if the solution to this feeling is buried between my teeth and gums. It feels like drowning, but it feels like burning, and it feels like fucking forever. I imagine my feet moving with trails of dust behind them like those cartoons because somehow it feels like I'm moving faster than the 60 seconds they've allowed in a minute. All the while, I'm just playing catch up on the stopwatch. And it doesn't add up like it did in high school mathematics. I can't carry the 1 and find the square root of the problem because most of the time, there is no problem. There's no life or death situation. There's no rhyme or reason. There is just feelings, and I'm feeling all of them at once. Some days are better than others. Some days are worse. But they're just days. And I've got more where they came from.